Welcome to the deep dive, where we sift through the noise to bring you the signal, those crucial nuggets of knowledge that genuinely make you well informed.
Mhm.
Today we're plunging into, well, one of the most volatile and complex geopolitical landscapes. The escalating tensions and direct confrontations between Iran and Israel and the intricate web of international involvement.
That's right. Our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack the multiple layers of this conflict, moving beyond just the headlines to
Yeah.
give you a comprehensive understanding.
Yeah.
We'll be drawing from a range of recent reports and expert analyses, specifically focusing on the period from, say, late 2023 through mid-2025 to illuminate the current state of affairs, its historical roots, and the profound implications for the world.
Think of this as your shortcut to grasping not just what is happening, but why it matters on a global scale. We'll even try to uncover some surprising facts and shifts that you might not hear anywhere else. Okay, let's unpack this. So, as we look at the immediate past, from late 2023 through mid 2025, it's clear the intensity of this conflict has really ramped up dramatically.
Oh, absolutely.
What was it about the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel that truly redefined the nature of this long-standing antagonism, particularly pushing it towards such, well, direct confrontations?
That's an excellent point. October 7th was absolutely a pivotal moment, a real game changer.
Right.
It shattered previous red lines and immediately prompted a dramatic shift in Israel's posture. Now, Iran's longstanding support for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah isn't new, providing drones, rockets, funding.
Sure, that's been going on for decades.
Exactly. But the scale and directness of Israel's response post-October 7th, hitting Iranian targets in Syria and Lebanon with unprecedented frequency in early 2024, signaled a clear change in strategic calculus.
And we saw that immediate escalation, didn't we? I'm thinking of those deadliest strikes in months on March 29th, 2024, hitting Iran-backed forces in Syria's Aleppo and Lebanon,
hmm
even taking out a senior Hezbollah rocket commander. But then it escalated even further on April 1st, 2024, when Israel bombed a building in Damascus housing Iran's embassy and IRGC officers, killing 7 Iranian military advisors. What was the strategic significance of that particular strike?
Well, that Damascus strike was a direct challenge to Iran's sovereignty and its presence in the region. It wasn't just another proxy hit.
Yeah, definitely not.
It was a brazen, overt attack on what could be considered diplomatic soil, and crucially, it killed senior Iranian commanders.
Yeah.
This was clearly designed to be a significant blow to Iran's regional command structure.
A very deliberate message.
Absolutely.
Right.
And what's truly insightful, I think, is that this deliberate provocation led directly to Iran's unprecedented direct response.
Oh.
That huge drone and missile barrage launched at Israel on April 13, 2024.
Right. That was the first time Iran had directly attacked Israel from its own soil on that scale.
Exactly. That was a game changer. It moved things from proxy skirmishes to direct state-on-state confrontation.
Mhm.
Israel, of course, retaliated on April 19, and this tit-for-tat pattern continued, didn't it? Into October 2024, with Iran firing over 180 ballistic missiles toward Israel,
In retaliation for assassinations, yeah.
and Israel hitting back at Iranian military sites, just back and forth, escalating each time.
And then we hit June 2025, and the stakes just went through the roof. Israel launched what they called Rising Lion, a multi-day strike campaign that went deep into Iranian territory,
Deep inside, yeah.
targeting nuclear and military facilities, reportedly even killing senior IRGC commanders and nuclear scientists. This wasn't just another strike campaign, was it? How does this represent a fundamental shift?
It's a profound shift because it demonstrated Israel's willingness, and maybe more importantly, its capacity, to penetrate Iran's deeply buried nuclear and military assets.
Like Fordo.
Exactly. We're talking about strikes on centrifuge plants at Fordo and critical missile bases. This moves way beyond the shadow war we've seen for years. It's overt, high-stakes confrontation. It fundamentally alters Tehran's strategic calculus, forcing a direct response rather than just relying on proxies.
And Iran did respond directly again.
It did. Iran launched its own missiles aimed at Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities, and this time inflicting civilian casualties. But what's particularly striking here is how quickly the U.S. became directly involved.
That's the part that really underscored the global stakes, isn't it? On June 22, 2025, the U.S. carried out these massive airstrikes on Iran's Borid Fordo nuclear plant.
Using those huge bunker buster bombs.
Yeah, the 30,000-pound ones. And they hit other sites, too. U.S. officials were careful, though, to state these were precision attacks targeting Iran's nuclear program, not an attempt at regime change. What message was the U.S. sending there?
Well, the message was pretty unambiguous, I think. The U.S. is not only committed to preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, but it also possesses the specific capabilities, those bunker busters, to disable even deeply protected facilities.
Right.
It really underscored that U.S.-Israeli joint pledge to deny Iran nuclear arms. And this direct action, well, it then prompted Iran's parliament to approve a bill threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz if attacked.
Which is a chilling reminder of the economic choke point Iran holds.
Exactly. Huge implications for global oil.
So beyond the kinetic strikes, the missiles and bombs, there's this whole invisible war going on in cyberspace too, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. It's truly a multi-front conflict.
We've seen cyber attacks from both sides. Can you give us a sense of the scale and impact of this digital battlefield?
Yeah, the cyber front is critical and I think often underestimated. For instance, you had this pro-Israeli hacking group called Predatory Sparrow. They hit Iran's banking and fuel systems back in late 2023, caused nationwide outages at gas stations. Iran's own oil minister confirmed something like 70% of their pumps were disabled.
Wow, 70%. That's a massive disruption to daily life.
Huge. And Predatory Sparrow claimed another major hit in June 2025, saying they wiped data from Iran's state bank SIPA and, get this, stole approximately $90 million from an Iranian cryptocurrency exchange.
$90 million. That's a significant financial blow on top of the data loss.
Mm.
What about Iran's cyber capabilities? Are they hitting back?
Oh, definitely. Iran, meanwhile, has been very active using its own cyber tools and disinformation against Israel. In late 2023, Israeli cyber defense officials managed to thwart an Iranian or possibly Hezbollah-linked hack on an Israeli hospital,
Okay.
though some patient data was apparently stolen. And then in June 2025, we saw Iranian-backed hackers spreading false alerts, things like fake bomb warnings, shelter scams on social media.
Trying to sow panic.
Exactly. They even briefly hijacked Iranian TV broadcasts with anti-government messages, though it's not clear who was behind that specific incident. The sheer volume of disinformation flooding Israel's networks also led Tehran to shut down Iran's entire internet nationwide in June 2025.
They shut down their own internet.
Yeah, apparently to stop panic from spreading. That move speaks volumes about the level of internal disruption they feared.
So as the physical battlefield expanded, so too did this unseen front of cyber warfare. Okay, what was the immediate fallout of all this escalating multi-front conflict on the world stage? How did diplomats and international bodies react?
Well, unsurprisingly, these military and cyber exchanges led to significant diplomatic escalations. Both Iran and Israel expelled diplomatic staff, publicly traded threats after each major military exchange. It got very heated.
Right.
The U.S. and its allies responded with urgent warnings and evacuations. In June 2025, the U.S. evacuated dozens of embassy personnel from Tel Aviv, advised Americans abroad to exercise extreme caution.
And warnings at home too, right?
Yes. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security warned of a heightened threat environment domestically, citing possible cyber attacks or even violence.
It seems like the sense of urgency just intensified across the board. I remember the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, warning back in April 2024 that the Middle East was on the edge of the cliff.
Yeah.
It really underscored the global anxiety, didn't it?
It really did. That statement was a stark recognition of the perilous trajectory things were on. United Nations officials also repeatedly called for restraint. The UN Security Council discussed the June 2025 strikes, and Secretary General Guterres warned that the bombings represented a perilous turn, urging a halt to the fighting.
So the consistent message from international bodies was just deep alarm.
Deep alarm and a plea for de-escalation before it spins entirely out of control.
Okay, so to really grasp the depth and I guess the intensity of this current situation, we probably need to step back a bit, look at the historical roots.
Absolutely crucial.
For many, the pivotal turning point for Iran's relationship with Israel, and really the whole region, was the 1979 Islamic Revolution. How did that single event just fundamentally reshape everything?
It was, well, seismic is probably the right word. The 1979 revolution replaced a pro-Western monarchy with a theocratic regime. And for its new leaders, hostility toward Israel became an ideological core. It was baked in from the start.
Right.
Almost immediately, Iran severed all ties with Israel. Iranian leaders began to declare Israel a cancer on the region, championing Palestinian causes as a central tenet of their foreign policy. This wasn't just politics. It was deep ideological reorientation that, continues to drive their actions today.
That ideological shift certainly set the stage for decades of indirect conflict, what we often call proxy warfare. How did that strategy evolve for Iran, and why has it been so central to their approach for so long?
Well, since the 1980s, Iran has largely chosen to confront Israel indirectly. Using proxies offers plausible deniability, right? And it avoids a direct state-on-state war that could invite overwhelming retaliation, especially from the U.S.
Makes sense.
So, for example, Iran helped found Hezbollah in Lebanon back in 1982, specifically to oppose Israel's invasion there. And by 1983, Iranian-backed Hezbollah carried out those devastating suicide bombings that drove Israeli forces out of most of Lebanon.
Right.
Iran also forged strong ties with the Palestinian militants like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, funneling money, weapons, training. This allowed them to project power and exert influence across the region without directly putting Iranian boots on the ground against Israel.
And the 2006 war.
Yeah, the 2006 month-long war between Israel and Hezbollah, which basically ended in a stalemate, really showcased the effectiveness of this proxy model for Iran. And we still see sporadic rocket launches at Israel by Iranian proxies in Gaza and now Yemen too, with the Houthis.
Okay, so beyond the proxies, there's also the very alarming issue of Iran's nuclear program and this shadow war around it. This seems to be right at the heart of much of the tension, doesn't it?
It really does. How did Iran's covert nuclear enrichment program, which was revealed back in 2002, impact this already fraught relationship?
Yeah.
Well, it immediately alarmed Israel in the West, and it triggered this prolonged shadow war, sabotage, assassinations.
Covert actions.
Exactly. Throughout the 2000s, both Israel and the U.S. took covert actions to slow Iran's nuclear work. The most famous example is probably the 2010 Stuxnet cyber attack on Iran's Natanz facility.
Right, the computer worm.
Yeah, a sophisticated, state-sponsored cyber weapon, widely attributed to Israel and the U.S., designed to physically damage centrifuges.
And Israeli leaders have been consistently, very publicly vocal about their opposition to Iran's nuclear ambitions, right? Pushing for a tough international stance.
It's extremely vocal. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for instance, famously lauded the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal back in 2018. And then in 2022, the U.S. and Israel signed that joint pledge to ensure Iran never obtains nuclear weapons.
What's the core of that unwavering Israeli position? Just an existential threat?
Fundamentally, yes. They view a nuclear-armed Iran, given its stated ideology and hostility, as an unacceptable existential danger. And this shadow war also involves assassinations. Tehran blames Israel for killing key nuclear scientists like Mostafa Ahmadi-Roshan in 2012 and Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in 2021.
To disrupt the program.
Explicitly to disrupt the weapons program, yes. And Israel has also repeatedly bombed Iranian arms shipments and facilities in Syria for years, trying to block weapons transfers to Hezbollah and other proxies.
And those strikes intensified dramatically after October 7th.
Dramatically. After Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attack, Israel massively stepped up these strikes on Iranian-linked targets in Syria and Lebanon. And as we discussed earlier, by mid-2025, they even began attacking inside Iran itself. It really signifies a shift from the shadows into, well, overt, even if undeclared conflict.
Okay, let's pull back again and look at the broader landscape, starting with a major player, the United States. Its role as Israel's closest ally is undeniable.
Absolutely.
For decades, the U.S. is committed to Israel's security, viewing Iran's hostility and nuclear program as major threats to regional stability. What are the sort of bedrock principles guiding this U.S. involvement?
The bedrock principles are indeed long-standing. Decades of unparalleled diplomatic and military backing for Israel. That May 2022 pledge by President Biden and then Prime Minister Lapid to deny Iran nuclear arms just reaffirms this core commitment.
Right.
American policymakers across administrations really have consistently warned Iran against building a bomb, always maintaining that military force remains an option on the table to prevent it.
And the military presence.
Yeah, the U.S. maintains a significant military presence in the Middle East, bases in the Gulf. The U.S. Fifth Fleet primarily for deterrence, but also for ensuring open shipping lanes, especially the Strait of Hormuz, which is just vital for global energy.
And then in June 2025, we saw the U.S. directly joining those strikes against Fordo.
Yeah.
Coordinating with Israeli forces, officials emphasized precision attacks, not regime change. But what were the domestic U.S. political considerations influencing that kind of direct action?
Well, domestically, U.S. policy towards Israel and Iran is shaped by, frankly, broad bipartisan support in Congress for Israel's security, coupled with deep skepticism, even hostility, towards Iran's intentions across the political spectrum.
So administrations have to navigate that.
They do. They have to navigate complex regional dynamics, global interests like energy prices, maintaining alliances, all while being extremely cautious not to get dragged into a full-scale open-ended war. It's a tough balance.
Yep.
You saw that quote from former President Trump reported by Reuters in June 2025, saying he wouldn't ask Israel to scale back attacks. That kind of underscores the political challenges of reining in an ally in this context.
Right. And the government also issued warnings domestically.
Yes, warnings about possible Iranian-sponsored terrorism or cyber threats at home. DHS issued alerts, law enforcement raised security. The State Department evacuated embassy personnel from Tel Aviv, advised citizens to stay vigilant. It definitely had domestic resonance.
So it's not just a foreign policy challenge, but one with direct implications for American citizens and security. Okay, how do other international voices react? Let's start with Russia and China both have strategic ties with Iran. What are their motivations here?
Their motivations are, well, multifaceted. Both Russia and China have those strategic ties with Iran and have consistently criticized U.S. and Israeli actions. Russia, for example, urged the U.S. not to strike Iran, warning that attacking nuclear facilities could trigger a nuclear catastrophe.
Strong language.
Very. Moscow condemned the June 2025 U.S. bombings as unprovoked aggression and even offered to mediate between Iran and the U.S. A clear bid for diplomatic influence.
And they acted at the UN.
Yes. Russia and China co-sponsored a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. China, with its growing economic ties to Iran, joined Russia in urging restraint, mainly reflecting concern over oil markets and regional stability.
Is there an economic angle for Russia, too?
Well, some analysts believe Russia's leadership might also see an opportunity. If the conflict drives up oil prices significantly, it could potentially force other countries to increase their reliance on Russian energy, undermining sanctions. So there's that potential angle, too.
Interesting. Okay, meanwhile, the European Union seems to take a somewhat different approach, often stressing de-escalation and diplomacy. What's the primary EU concern?
The EU's primary concern is clearly preventing a wider regional war. Josep Borrell's warning back in April 2024 about the region being on the edge of the cliff really summed up their apprehension.
They still want the nuclear deal back.
They do. European powers continue to support reviving the Iran nuclear negotiations, basically seeing a return to the 2015 deal or something like it as the best check on Iran's nuclear ambitions. Borrell specifically noted it's in everyone's interest that Iran does not become a nuclear power, really highlighting their preference for a diplomatic solution over military confrontation.
Okay, then you have the Gulf Arab states, who are geographically right in the middle of this.
Right in the crosshairs.
They've been acting as intermediaries, publicly trying to stay neutral, prevent spillover. What's their strategy?
It's a very, very delicate balancing act for them. You saw that meeting in October 2024. Gulf officials met with Iran in Doha to reassure Tehran of their neutrality and push for urgent de-escalation.
They must be terrified of a wider war.
Deeply. Gulf leaders fear an Iran-Israel war would threaten their critical oil infrastructure and potentially draw U.S. forces onto their soil, which they really don't want. So they've leveraged recent ties with both sides.
Like the Abraham Accords and the Saudi-Iran rapprochement?
Exactly. Using things like the UAE and Bahrain normalizing relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia's recent rapprochement with Iran to communicate behind the scenes. Urging restraint from Israel and the U.S., while pressing Iran not to escalate. Their number one goal is stability.
And globally, how are the markets reacting to all this continued instability?
Well, global markets have been highly reactive, as you'd expect. Brent crude, the international oil benchmark, hit multi-month highs, surging over $80 a barrel in June 2025, mostly on fears of potential regional supply disruptions.
And other international actors.
The UN, as we mentioned, repeatedly calling for restraint, expressing deep concern about civilian casualties. Some Muslim-majority countries condemned Israel's April 2024 strike on Iran's consulate in Syria, but Israel's other allies largely backed its right to defend itself. It's a mixed bag internationally.
So given all these moving parts, all this history, all the international reactions, what do the experts see as the potential future scenarios? Is there still a diplomatic off-ramp, a way for this to actually de-escalate?
Well, in theory, yes. A ceasefire, a return to diplomacy that could halt the fighting. Maybe Iran gets offered reduced sanctions if it stops its attacks.
But is that likely?
Honestly, observers widely regard this as highly unlikely right now, given the current political leadership on both sides. It would require enormous concessions from Iran, dismantling significant parts of its nuclear and missile programs, rolling back support for proxies. That would essentially look like capitulation.
And Iran won't negotiate under attack.
That's their stated position, yes, not negotiating while under attack. And meanwhile, U.S. officials have signaled they won't demand Israel stand down. So that window for talks seems very narrow, if not closed.
Okay, so if diplomacy looks unlikely, what's a more probable outcome? Maybe some kind of sustained stalemate. Strategic endurance.
That's generally seen as a more probable, though perhaps less satisfying outcome. Iran might absorb the damage from the strikes and shift into a kind of survival strategy.
How would that look?
Well, after the initial blows, Tehran could focus on rebuilding its defenses, maybe dispersing assets, definitely leveraging its proxies more, and crucially, trying to avoid direct Iranian casualties that could trigger an all-out U.S. war.
Right.
This idea of strategic endurance sort of echoes past cases like Saddam Hussein's Iraq after the first Gulf War, or maybe Syria after 2012 regimes that survived massive blows but stayed in power.
So not direct confrontation, but continued pressure.
Probably. Iran's leadership is unlikely to attack the U.S. directly, but they might increase asymmetrical actions. Stepped-up missile or drone strikes via Hezbollah, maybe intensified attacks by the Houthis on shipping, more covert operations against Israeli or allied targets.
And they've threatened Israel's supporters, too.
They have. Iran threatened that if Israel supporters enter the fight, they could be targeted too, which is an implicit warning to Gulf states or Western interests in the region.
That sounds like a continuous simmering conflict, just fraught with constant risk. But what about the doomsday scenario, a full-blown widening war across the Middle East? How plausible is that?
Well, this is obviously the worst-case scenario everyone wants to avoid. If Iran chose full escalation, like moving on U.S. bases in Iraq or Syria, or actually trying to close the Strait of Hormuz,
That would be huge.
huge. It would risk provoking major retaliation by the U.S. and its NATO and Gulf partners. A direct U.S.-Iran war is generally seen as a red line for Tehran, a step they seem highly reluctant to cross because of the overwhelming military disparity.
But the Hormuz threat is still there.
The tension over oil flows in the strait remains very high. Iran's parliament did endorse possibly blocking it. That step could send global oil prices absolutely skyrocketing and would almost certainly draw in the U.S. Fifth Fleet.
And the proxies would join in.
Iran's regional proxies stand ready to escalate, either in support of Tehran or just to target Israel and Western interests if the fight drags on. Now, Russia and China would likely oppose such a wider war because of the immense economic fallout, and the Gulf Arabs would urgently try to contain any spillover onto their territory.
So what would be the long-term regional consequences of any of these scenarios beyond the immediate fighting itself?
Well, beyond the fighting, the long-term consequences could be significant. You might see a renewed arms race. If Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure is severely degraded, sure, Israel might feel safer temporarily.
Right.
But Iran's neighbors, maybe even countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, might feel compelled to further pursue their own deterrence capabilities. That creates a whole new, potentially more unstable regional dynamic.
Yeah, and the economy.
Oil markets would likely face chronic uncertainty, investors worrying about supply disruptions. So far, we've only seen precautionary price jumps, but a wider conflict, that's different.
What about U.S. influence?
That's another question. A prolonged conflict could erode U.S. influence if Washington focuses primarily on Israel, potentially causing traditional partners in the region to demand stronger safeguards or even seek alternative alliances.
Or it could go the other way.
Possibly. Successful Israeli-American strikes might embolden U.S. policy hawks to push for even tougher measures on Iran. And we absolutely cannot forget the humanitarian impacts, which are already dire.
Yeah.
Immense civilian casualties, massive infrastructure damage in Iran and Gaza. A protracted war would just worsen refugee crises and deepen sectarian tensions across the entire region.
What an incredibly dense and critical deep dive this has been. We've journeyed from the immediate dramatic escalations of 2024-2025 back through the historical roots, explored the complex roles of global players, the U.S., Russia, China, the Gulf states, and peered into these really fraught possibilities for the future. Our goal really was to help you gain a clearer understanding of these intricate dynamics and their global ripple effects.
Indeed. And this deep dive just shows how profoundly interconnected global security, energy markets, regional stability, it's all linked. What truly captures the complexity here, I think, is how this interplay of historical grievances, strategic ambitions, and just the sheer unpredictability of human events continues to shape this critical part of the world, pushing it, as Borrell said, right to the very edge.
So what does this all mean for you, listening? Perhaps it's a moment to consider how quickly localized conflicts can cascade across the globe, influencing everything from the price of fuel to international alliances. And maybe why understanding the nuances, not just the headlines, is more important than ever for navigating our really interconnected world.